Greetings, my name is Sam, I am an alcoholic, and I'm also a son of recovery. Let's start out with the Serenity Prayer. Good and gracious God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. So, I am currently reading 12 Secular Steps, and I'm in Chapter 2. This is the biology of addiction, and it is a kind of long chapter, so I'm going to divide it up into a few different sections. So, let's start. Chapter summary. Well, a well-established addiction is easily recognized by its insanity. The costs rise ever higher, yet the malignant cycle only escalates in response to the wreckage. For many, an understanding of the biology of addiction will help make sense of the extremes that define this disorder. In this chapter, we first examine how a repetitive, excessive stimulation of a specific area of the brain known as the reward center becomes the primary force that generates and sustains addiction. This is a dangerous part of the brain to dysregulate. We further discuss two important brain regions, the limbic system, which contains the reward center, and the frontal cortex, both of which undergo significant physical changes during the progression of addiction. In this and the next chapter, we will link the biological features of addiction to behavioral patterns commonly seen in addicts. Overall, we can describe the disease of addiction in terms of a physical and behavioral reprogramming of a person's mind, and this pathological reprogramming results in a downward spiral of dependency despite rising negative consequences. Addiction is rewarding. We use alcohol and drugs because they work. In fact, they work really well. Their job, essentially, is to change the way we feel. An important part of their mood-altering effect is the ability to increase the activity of a small chemical messenger called dopamine within a specific area of the brain known as the reward center. Some drugs, like cocaine and methamphetamine, can directly activate the reward center with intense surges of dopamine activity. Others, alcohol, sedatives, marijuana, and narcotic painkillers, take less direct paths of additionally affect other parts of the brain. But a repetitive activation of the reward center with excessive dopamine activity seems to be an essential part of all addiction, whether it be to a drug or to an addictive behavior, gambling, sex, food, pornography, even cell phone games. From an evolutionary viewpoint, we are not well equipped to handle the many easily accessible, potent, and potentially addictive substances and activities to which we are now exposed. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. The brain is made of specialized cells called neurons. These neurons group together to form specific brain structures, and each structure is responsible for carrying out unique functions within the brain. To perform their duties, neurons constantly communicate with one another by secreting small chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. When an excitatory neurotransmitter, like dopamine, is released among neighboring neurons, it creates a wave of activation among them. The purpose of this localized pulse of activation is to switch a specific brain area from an off state to an on state. From there, the wave of excitation further spreads through nerve tracts to other brain areas. These web-like patterns of excitation among different brain regions can either create or modify our moods, thoughts, memories, and behaviors. In addition to excitatory neurotransmitters like dopamine, there are also inhibitory neurotransmitters. These signals can return an active brain structure to the off state, or they can suppress a brain area and prevent its activation in the first place. One inhibitory neurotransmitter found throughout the brain, including the reward center, is a signal molecule called GABA, gamma aminobutyric acid. Overall, the control of brain activity is managed by the balanced effects of excitatory neurotransmitters acting as gas pedals and inhibitory neurotransmitters performing as brakes. To understand the biology of addiction, it is important to remember that drugs of abuse can powerfully amplify the natural effects of these neurotransmitters, and by doing so, they create a high. They perform this chemical work very consistently. A closer look at neurotransmitter signaling. In the figure, and there is a figure. In the figure below, we see how dopamine release by a signaling neuron activates a nearby receiving neuron. Neurotransmitters sent by one neuron can be received by another neuron only if it is the correct receptor for that signal. The dopamine released by the signaling cell has a lock and key fit to the dopamine receptors on the surface of the receiving cell. Also observe that the more dopamine released by the signaling cell, the more intense the effects will be downstream of the receiving cell. Another important feature seen on the signaling neuron is the presence of dopamine transporters. This space between communicating neurons, called a synapse, is quickly cleared of neurotransmitters by these transporters. Dopamine transporters in the reward center rapidly vacuum up the secreted dopamine and reset the synapses to the off state. Because of this rapid reuptake and other mechanisms, neurotransmitters signaling between neurons is very fast. Typically, a pulse of neurotransmitter communication measures a few hundredths or even thousandths of a second. When dopamine transporters are blocked by cocaine, the dopamine will remain in the synapse and continue to signal. This extended dopamine signaling will strongly activate the reward center and create the high experienced by the user. The intensity and duration of the drug's effect depends on the amount of drug used as well as the method by which it was taken into the body. For instance, if cocaine is smoked, crack cocaine, or injected, then very high concentrations are instantly achieved in the bloodstream and simultaneously in the brain. The user experiences a short but very intense and dangerous high. Different drugs produce different effects on mood. Highs caused by one class of drugs can seem very different from even the opposite of the highs caused by another class. Depending on which receptors and additional brain areas of drug either stimulates or suppresses, its overall effect can be described as upper, stimulating, empowering, downer, tranquilizing, and euphoric or hallucinogenic, etc. Sometimes a drug even causes a paradoxical effect. Alcohol, for example, at first feels like a stimulant, then hours later like a depressant. Alcohol is and was a depressant all along. It initially depresses areas of the brain responsible for suppressing impulsiveness. That makes alcohol an inhibitor of an inhibitor, which is like a double negative in a sentence that transforms it into a positive statement. I'm not going to dance on the top of the table. The amygdala is another part of the brain paradoxically liberated by alcohol. This small but emotionally powerful area can engage fight or flight responses, and its unintentional stimulation is likely to produce an angry drunk. Despite being initially perceived as a stimulant, alcohol steadily depresses areas of the brain responsible for motor and cognitive skills. This effect produces the typical signs of drunkenness: staggering, slurred and loud speech, poor muscle coordination, bad judgment, and eventually passing out. The impact of drugs like crack cocaine or intravenous heroin are so fast and powerful that we could hardly consider their use as safe or social. The outcome is incapacitating, literally mind-blowing, as inhibitory controls are completely overwhelmed by the tidal wave of excitatory impacts. By comparison, the milder dopamine surge and psychological effects of social drinking, perhaps 1 or 2 glasses of wine over the course of an hour, are usually easily countered by GABA and other layers of inhibitory, that's enough, control. In general, the socially acceptable use of drugs is physically characterized by a pleasantly modified but still functional balance of excitation and inhibition within the brain. We can still engage in conversation with people who have a glass of wine or 2 with dinner, but not so much with someone who just injected a big blast of cocaine, meth, or heroin. Most drugs taken orally, sedatives, painkillers, alcohol, etc., are absorbed gradually. So under normal conditions, the rise in blood and brain levels are also relatively gradual. However, a large or cumulative dose can still overwhelm inhibitory negative controls, as demonstrated in the obvious loss of behavioral control seen during binge drinking. Also, continued use over time leads to tolerance, which means more drug is needed to achieve the desired effect. Tolerance leads to increasingly larger doses, which eventually tends to overpower the user's ability to put on the brakes and control use. Addictive drugs harness the power of positive reinforcement. A surge of dopamine signaling in the reward center is consciously experienced as pleasure, and as a rule, nothing motivates people quite like pleasure does. Normally, these delightful dopamine spikes serve as psychological cookies, positive reinforcement to reward behaviors worth repeating. Sex, a sumptuous meal, a positive social interaction, winning a competition. These are examples of activities that earn dopamine rewards. From a biological viewpoint, the repetition of a rewarded behavior generally serves as a worthwhile purpose, such as procreation, nourishment, and positive social interactions. Punishment, negative consequence, on the other hand, is meant to have the opposite effect and lead to avoidance of the behavior. Punishment is meant to condition us to avoid behaviors that are potentially harmful to us. Operant conditioning is a scientific term for a generalized psychological theory. Rewards increase the repetition of behaviors, while punishments decrease recurrence. Parents and other animal trainers use this strategy all the time. Operant conditioning is just one of several learning processes or strategies that can be used to modify behavior. Imitation is another common learning strategy. Reasoning will work too, sometimes. And I am going to stop there. So we will continue on with part 2 of the biology of addiction next time. And now I'm going to read this Blessings by the Buddha from my prayer book. I have this wonderful, the 12-step prayer book. So you can have any higher power you want. I'm going to read this one from the Buddha. May every creature abound in well-being and peace. May every living being, weak or strong, the long and the small, the short and the medium size, the mean and the great. May every living being, seen and unseen, those living far off, those nearby, those already born and those waiting to be born, may all attain inward peace. Let no one deceive one another. Let no one despise another in any situation. Let no one from apathy or hatred wish evil to anyone at all. Just as a mother, with her own life, protects her child from hurt, so within yourself foster a limitless concern for every living creature. Display a heart of boundless love for all the world, in all its height and depth and broad extent. Love unrestrained, without hate or hostility. Then, as you stand or walk, sit or lie, until, overcome by drowsiness, devote your mind entirely to this. It is known as living here, life divine. And with that, I say please leave any comments, questions, or thoughts, and I hope that you have a blessed day. Thanks.